So welcome all of you who are attending this live. We are going to talk about family constellations tonight, but I just thought I'd introduce myself and then ask Poppy Altmann to do the same, because some of you will know me, some of you will know Poppy, and some of you might not know either of us, because of course we never know where people are coming in from entirely. So, and there's names in the register where I'm like, oh, old friend. So thank you to those of you who are joining live. And if you're watching this on catch up, we're still available for any questions. And obviously when I send out the link to this, we'll put some notes in. So I'm Caroline Gaskin. I've been in practice as a homeopath for 25 years this year, and that feels quite incredible. That is a quarter of a century, and makes me wonder what I'm going to do for the next quarter of a century. Will it all be homeopathy or not? I don't know. So when I first came into practice, and I was having a conversation about teaching today, and when I first came into practice, I made assumptions really about what I would add into my practice. And I thought I was going to add in being a fertility teacher, natural fertility teacher, and a breastfeeding consultant, because quite a lot of my clients at that time, I'd been working at the Active Birth Centre doing their press and PR during my homeopathic training. And quite a lot of my clients at the time were mums, young mums. I was working at the Active Birth Centre. I did a drop-in clinic there, and that kind of fed my full-time practice, if you like. But I didn't actually do any of that. What really grew my practice hugely was my relationship with other homeopaths and with other natural health practitioners. And I'm introducing it like this because Family Constellations is not homeopathy, but it's something that many homeopaths are interested in, and many of you that are listening are homeopaths. And but I'm also aware that it's something which is very much part of the therapeutic space, and I've been interested in that word, and it sounds quite enigmatic when you first hear it. So I've built my practice much more through working with other therapists to bring the best to my clients. So that might be craniosacral therapists, cranial osteopaths, aromatherapists, herbalists, all sorts of complementary therapists, maybe talk therapists. Sometimes it might be something that might sound a little bit left field, like learning creative writing. But when you're in this energetic healing space, all sorts of wonderful messages come in. And one of the things like we were talking about today with our student body and how we support and encourage students into a full and a fulsome practice is to encourage them to be open-minded, to encourage them to continue to want to expand, grow, and learn. And that isn't necessarily learning a lot more homeopathic remedies. That is growth on all sorts of levels. And when you start to, as you know, clear the undergrowth, clear out the guff, clear out the messages that have perhaps impeded us for the whole of our lives and held us back. When you start to clear out that growth, you allow new growth in. And sometimes it takes a trauma for something to be ignited or excited in us. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to ask Poppy to introduce herself. She and I are great friends, and I've worked with her doing family constellations once, and I intend to do it again because it's absolutely fascinating. Over to you, Poppy.
Thanks, Caroline. I just sent you a message saying, do you want me to let the people in the waiting room in? But I suppose you can do that now. So I'm Poppy Altmann. Thanks for having me, Caroline. Caroline was my teacher at CPH in 2000. I finished in 2006. I graduated as a homeopath, and then I worked as a homeopath for, well, I mean, I still do see the odd client. And Caroline was my supervisor in those early days and while I was a student. And then in 2015, I became interested in family constellations through a weird coincidence, as these things always are, so-called coincidence, where a friend of mine had been talking about it for years and saying, you must go, you must go, you must go. I represented someone's father. It was amazing. And I was like, what is all this? I didn't really understand. And I did want to go, and I could never go at the times that he was suggesting we went. And then my colleague and friend Nafia also started going to family constellation sessions and raving about it. And yeah, and then it's a long story, but I ended up in a field in a yurt with 45 other people, and Barbara Morgan, my teacher, doing family constellations for 5 days solidly at the Unicorn Constellations camp, which is actually happening week after next. And oh no, next week. Yeah, next week. And I had sort of radical experiences there that really were life-changing. And I ended up doing Barbara's training, which started 3 weeks later. And then I carried on with that. I did that for 1.5 years, and I started facilitating. And then I carried on and did 2 more trainings with Barbara as an apprentice trainer. And then for the last 2 trainings, and including the one that's happening now, I've been her assistant. So I'm an assistant trainer, and I still do workshops and retreats and so on, and see people individually with family constellations.
So thank you. That's a lot in a small space, but so many questions. So first off, what are they and why are they called family constellations? I mean, what are 2 amazing words to bring together?
Yeah, I mean, I could answer the second one first, because I think there was some discussion over what to call it in English. And in the end, this was settled on. And I suppose, I mean, I can talk, the aspect of constellations is the grouping. It's nothing to do with astrology, but it's to do with this idea of people in certain positions in groups that happen in families, you know, so the position in your position in a family and how does it look? That's very important to constellations. And then what is family constellations is I always, as Barbara, my teacher, also says, always answer this in a different way, and I just have to trust what's going to come. So yeah, I just feel into that. It's a kind of group work that looks at inherited trauma and unconscious things in the family. And so we use people in the group to represent members of our family. And then we basically set them up, which means that the client puts them somewhere in the room, and we see what's unfolding. And we do that based on very little, you know, very sort of factual information. So I, as a facilitator, I want to know about the facts. I don't want to know the stories that we have around the facts. And, you know, a lot of us spend a lot of time in talking therapies and doing that work where we're trying to make sense of things in our heads. But constellations is really an embodied practice. So the idea is that your body it's where your soul lives. And it's there's information stored in your DNA and in your inheritance, what you've received from your ancestors and from your parents, and the life that you have, that it gives you information that you're not conscious of necessarily in your head. Yeah, does that make any sense?
Absolutely, it really does. And I think one of the things that wasn't clear to me, because I heard about representing somebody, that somebody would say, this is my story, I have this problem in my life that I would like to solve, or tackle or deal with, and through the representation of that person with the issue and the others in their circle, the family, each person in the group represents somebody in that person's family, and what unfolds as others kind of intuitively, it feels reach for and almost dramatize that person's life. And what struck me when I was doing it was how fast people identified with the issue in hand and took up those roles and literally became those people in front of us. They didn't have to be actors, they didn't have to be trained.
Yeah.
They were embodying and being those characters in the story. And through that, you could see in front of you kind of the understanding of the situation, just like dropping in so fast. It was
Yeah.
fascinating.
I mean, absolutely. You don't, there's no acting, because it's not like psychodrama. Often people think it is psychodrama, where you're acting out a story that you've been told. There is no acting involved. Absolutely not. The core sort of principle, one of the core principles of constellations is coming to your authentic being in your body, coming to the truth. So there's, it's really feeling into, when you represent, and we don't really know how representative perception happens. We don't really know how as a representative what to do, but you have to let go of the idea of thinking, and you have to come into your body and just drop down into your body. And then when you're representing and you've been set up as a representative, you're really just feeling into what happens and going with that. So you're not changing anything. It may be that you just end up standing in one place, immobile, and nothing happens. And then it may be that you feel like you want to go over to that person and look at them, or maybe that a huge amount of grief comes up, or anger, and then you might, react to that or not. And so it's for the facilitator then to go and ask what's going on for you, and just for you to be as authentic as possible in your response. Oh, well, I'm not really feeling anything, or but it's all information. There's everything that goes on in the room and in the group and in the circle with representatives, with the client, with me as the facilitator. It's all information for the client.
And so we might, for instance, let's just take the issue being, say this it is an anger. What's your, if you don't react to that situation, the messaging and the way you've been, those kind of early templates around how you do or don't respond to anger, that's where the shift can be.
I would say it's deeper than that. It's like it's emotions come up as information for us, but sort of, I'm losing my chain of thought. It's like it's bigger than that. You're looking at the whole family system, so you're having a wider lens than just the emotions that are going on for an individual person, or for even people within the group, or even the history of from your childhood, this or that. We're looking beyond that. We're looking into the bigger family system. So, for example, like when I went to constellations, I always felt that I carried this burden from my dad, who was a Holocaust survivor. And I never really understood why that was, or, what it was about. And yeah, there were all these consequences of that, of his trauma and the trauma in our family and so on. But it wasn't really till I had it laid out in the constellation, and there were Nazis and there were Jews and there were, my family and our different loyalties that I didn't know about. And that was all there in the constellation. And it just gave me this completely different perspective. It's like a living map. To see
DNA.
Yeah, to see what's actually inside. And that's why the embodied process is so important, because it's all in there. So, when I'm working with a client, I'm really trying to get into what's going on in their body, because that's where the information is.
Yeah. And also, I think something that I wanted to ask earlier on was, you can do this in the one-to-one situation, and you can do it in the group situation. And is there a, this is better, this is recommended, and how do you do it in the one-to-one situation without actual people to say, you be my sister, you be my father, you be,
So for some people, one-to-one is preferable, because they may feel shame, or they may feel overexposed, they may feel shy, and they may not want to go and sit in front of a big group. and talk about, you know, the issues in their family,
Mhm.
or in their family system. So in that situation, yes, I do. I work one-to-one. I do it in various different ways. There's one way I do it, which is online with trainees from Barbara's training. So I'll get sort of 9 or
Right.
10 trainees, and they'll be representatives for this client, and they're all experienced representatives. And then the other way in a one-to-one live setting is, well, there are 3 ways of doing it. The first one is we can use little Playmobil people
Mhm.
to represent members of the family. So I will invite you to set them up as a client. I might say, choose, I'll have a bag of them, and I'll say, you know, choose someone for your father, choose someone for your mother, choose someone for you. And they just go into the bag blind and pick one out, and place it intuitively where they want to on the table. And then we look at the picture.
Mm.
And we might stay within that very sort of precise area, or we might go into one of the other ways of doing it, which is into visualization. So
Mhm.
sometimes you're sort of focusing down on these little figures, but really we need to bring this in as, this is your, you know, this is your father. Can you just close your eyes and imagine him standing in front of you? And it can sort of move into that realm, which is another way of doing it. You can just do constellations internally with your eyes shut, and you
Yeah.
visualize your family members or the aspects or concepts of your family system that need to come in. And then the
Yeah.
third way is you can use markers of some kind, like they maybe like pieces of felt. I use different colored pieces of felt. Some people have them cut like so the men are squares and the women are circles, and you have like an arrow so you know which way they're facing and stuff. And then you stand on those markers and you go into representation. So
Oh, okay.
I might ask the
Yeah.
client to represent their father or their brother, or I might stand on them and represent them, or I might check, because the client might have a story about what their brother thinks or what their brother's like, and then I'll go and step on it and test it. It's really, there's a lot of testing and experimenting with constellations, which is what I really like. It's like there's no dogma. It
Mm.
could be this, it could be that, but let's just test it. It's all phenomenological, meaning
Yeah.
just dealing with what comes up in that moment and working with that, and not
Yeah.
sort of forcing. There are sort of various philosophies in which are really important, created by Bert Hellinger, who's the founder of constellations. But what overrides that is the phenomenology.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, do you remember Twister?
Yeah.
It's a bit like grown up Twister. Except for you get to go back to, you know, like the child stuff where most of us should have been as children, which is, you know, laughing and playing and enjoying ourselves.
Well, that's a big, I mean,
So
that is a big part of it, because, you know,
yeah.
often we don't, as children, we have this thing called blind love, where we just want
Mhm.
to save our parents no
Mhm.
matter what, and we'll do anything to make them all right. But that is at a cost to us, because it's the wrong order. So in constellations, we have this idea of orders. There's sort of 2 main things that are really, philosophies that are really important. One of them is that there's an order in everything. And in terms of order, parents give and children take. And it can't be the other way around. No one's going to thrive when the child is trying to give to the parents.
Mm.
So they take from the parents. But when we go into that place of, we've got to make it all right for our parents, we've got to keep them together, or we've got to, you know, take away my dad's pain, or, you know, all of that, then there's an imbalance in the family system. And it's
Yeah.
usually to do with trauma in previous generations.
Yeah.
And there's
And I
another.
think that's the reaching back, isn't it, to previous generations, which struck me as a couple of things I wanted to ask you around that. But yeah, if you could elaborate on that capacity with this to heal the previous generational trauma. I mean, that's just, and what about futures? So there's a, you know, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, exactly. You know, that's really why most of us go into the work, is that either that we've got children or grandchildren that we want, you know, we want to have a better experience than we did for whatever reason, or if we don't have children, we might have creative projects, you know, that are our business, or, you know, the things that we are putting into the world in the same way that we put children into the world. You know, we want to see them thrive, whether it's a child or a business or a project or our creativity. You know, all of those things, we want them to be great in the world. And so that's kind of why we're doing that work. It gives us a greater ability to thrive, because in the past generations, so usually what's a really big issue that we see come up with constellations is, so as well as there's an order and the order gets disrupted, the order often gets disrupted because we don't recognize that everyone in a family system belongs. So that means there are lots of people who are excluded in family systems. And culturally and historically, it's not only people, I mean, it's also things like grief and rage. We don't do those in our family, but they get excluded for whatever reason. It might be that a child died tragically really young and we couldn't deal with that. So this, 100 years ago, just didn't talk about that child. They weren't given a name, they weren't included, or they were given away. What if there was a child who was given away for adoption, even against our will? I have lots of people whose mothers were given away because they were born, out of wedlock and so on. Or it could be someone who died tragically, or someone who was murdered, for example, or even killed in the war. So then if someone is murdered, the murderer belongs in the family system, and the victim belongs in the murderer's family system. And this is part of how we get outside of right and wrong. And also the war then belongs in the family system because it's had a massive impact pretty much on all of us. So we have that with genocide, war, emigration, immigration, natural disasters, colonialism, all of that, epidemics, pandemics, that kind of thing. So all of those things have an impact on the family system, and they all belong. So if we exclude them, if we continue to exclude them, someone down the line, it might be us, it might be our children or our projects, they suffer. And they try to rebalance the family system, either by trying to leave it and follow that person, or by not thriving out of guilt or whatever it is. So we can use then in the constellation, we can use like healing sentences to bring those aspects or people back into the system and tell them that they belong. If we're able to do that. And again, we have to test it. And if the client or representative is like, no way, then it's not ready to happen yet. But we've taken a first step and we've seen what needs to be done.
Yeah, fantastic.
And that creates energetic shifts throughout the system.
Yeah,
and things start to change.
Absolutely, and reminds me of giving a remedy and the wider circle benefiting. Or I remember once I was working on a retreat, and I had to take the remedies out with me, and I didn't want to take my radionics machine, so I had to kind of feel into the retreat to take which remedies, and I took some anacardium 200 with me, which is a remedy for anger, for internal conflict, for those of you that don't know. And I just was guided to take this remedy. But when I was away, it was like nobody actually walked in needing anacardium, but there was this background sense about the retreat that anacardium was needed. And I just thought, well, I haven't given myself a remedy. I'm just going to take the hit for the group. Because clearly that remedy was there for a reason.
That's part of the field, isn't it, Caroline?
It is, yeah.
Field. And that's very much what we're working with in Constellations, is a knowing field. Yeah. We all come together, and you're in the workshop, I'm in the workshop, she and he are in the workshop. We've all got something that connects us, consciously or unconsciously. It's not a coincidence that we're all there. We're all part of a field, and maybe you'll represent someone's, I don't know, you'll represent something that's relevant to your family system, even though you're doing the other person.
Yeah. Just one thing I wanted to share, which I suppose wasn't sort of completely unexpected, but when I did the session with you, I think 3 people were chosen to, when somebody's asked a question about this, but were looking for their representatives. So we had 3 sessions within that from memory. but two of the sessions were about money and people feeling that they weren't very good with money. And so I wanted to ask you, just in a general sense, what kind of themes do people bring to family constellations to sort out? Because it would be very easy to say it's always about the inner child or blah, blah, blah. You know, what kind of things do people present with and say, I just want to sort this out? Because you said business, you know, I mean, I love that. It's like, yeah, great.
Yeah, no, it's much sort of wider than the inner child. I mean, the inner child may be part of it, but it's definitely a bigger thing. And there's the main things are health. You know, it's what we all want: health, wealth or prosperity, abundance, whatever that is. Work, success in work, success in relationships. Yeah, I think those are the main things.
Great. Amazing. And Hannah asks, who decides what role you might take? So there's a client, a querent, you know, saying, I want success in business, for instance, and the group is going to, you know, create the dynamic. Who decides what role someone would take?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I'll decide who we need to represent, but let's say I say to the client, okay, I mean, often with work, it's to do with the male line. So I might say, choose someone for your father, and the client will choose them. I'll ask the client to choose someone for their father most of the time. And then they will look around the group and settle on someone just instinctively or just intuitively. Will you be my father? And then if the representative is happy to do that, then the client will come and put their hands on that representative's shoulders and just feel into their body and drop down, and the representative does the same, sort of acknowledging taking this role as the father, and then they position them in the circle. That's usually what happens. Having said that, if things are in flow and I just need a quick representative and I don't want to take the client out of where they are in that moment, then I might just say, oh, could you come in as the brother or something?
Yeah. And that actually points to a question I was about to ask, which is, I found things came up very fast, not just for me, but you know, in the session, and things shifted really fast. And sometimes that actually it got quite intense at one point, and I actually moved away from the intensity of the action. It was instinctive, and it really perhaps recalled something of my own story that wasn't being enacted in front of me about you know, physical contact, aggressive contact close to me. It was like, whoa, what was that about? You know, and what was my relationship to that? I think a lot can come up in the space, can't it?
Yeah, a lot can come up, and things do change quickly, because once we acknowledge what is, it changes instantly. That shift, that energy shift, that it's like craniosacral therapy, you know. Once you witness it and acknowledge it, then it changes immediately.
Yeah.
And yes, we can only manage what we can manage. So we, you know, trust people to look after themselves. But it does take courage to do the work. It's not sort of a light-hearted. Remember, my friend once said, oh, would you like to come to the workshop? And he said, yeah, that would be fun. And I said, it might not be fun. But yeah, it's not really, you know, it's quite intense. It can be. But then, you know, if the client is feeling that it's intense, we're all in service of the client when they're having a constellation. So we can just tone it down to match, you know, what they're comfortable with. So we just slow it down, come back into our bodies, you know, and just wait and just check in with how they're doing, and if they're ready to take the next step or look at the next thing that's coming up. And if they're not, that's fine. You know, I always work with what's going on.
And one of the things, because I know you're very passionate about what you do and what you get engaged with and why you're here, and I just thought, what gets you about family constellations? Because I can see that it's something that you'd get into and you'd want to do more of. I'd like to do more at some stage myself, but
yeah, I think that, well, there's a few things. I mean, one thing is my own family trauma, of which, you know, I was really kind of unaware until I got into constellations, and it goes back, you know, a long way. on both sides, and also in my children's family, so my ex-partner's family, you know, there's a lot of trauma. That's what gets me, is that I do it for my children essentially, but also for my life. You know, I want to take my life and live it as best I can. And I want them to be able to do that. So I'm doing as much work as I can for them.
Yeah.
And then in terms of like why family constellations, I've just found it to be so transformational so quickly. Like you say, you know, when I went to that first camp, I was so unwell, Caroline. I was like, I had massive edema in my legs. I was breathless. I had an irregular heartbeat. My thyroid was out of whack. And I was really, really not well. And after 2 days of being there, you know, I had just been running out and peeing all through the constellations. And within 2 days, all the edema had gone.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it, you know, and it began like a really profound health journey. And I was a homeopath. I'd been working with my health for 10 years or more, you know, a lot more actually, 20 years. But I still had these issues that I was carrying that I just couldn't work out what they were. I couldn't work it out with my head or with a conversation with a therapist or a homeopath or whatever kind of therapy it was. But when I did constellations, things radically changed, and I could deal with a huge amount of stuff in one session, in 1 hour. You know, and even if it wasn't my constellation, which it wasn't when I lost those 4 stone of water or whatever it was, I hadn't even done my own constellation. You know, I was just there.
Wow. So you hadn't even done your own. That's a really important point. So you hadn't even done your own. You were engaged in the process
I
for
don't
other
even know if I
people. It's a
represent.
collective story, and wow.
Because we
That
all
is
have,
amazing.
you know, that's the other thing, Caroline, is we all have each other's story in our family system. We come from the same, come from the human race, you know. So we all have these human stories. We all have someone in our family system, you know, a mother who lost a child, somewhere in our family system, someone who had to leave their home, you know, something like that. It all these things resonate. It's the human condition.
Yeah.
So it's there in us.
Yeah. And I did that session with you, and I was part of the group. I wasn't the client. What do you call them? The querent. Yeah,
Right.
it feels, yeah, because
Usually,
in tarot it would be the querent, and
yeah,
that
or the
feels
issue
like
holder, you know.
issue holder.
Usually you come with an issue, and I try and turn that into a longing. Like, what is it you want? You know.
Yeah, everyone else comes with the tissues because it's. But then I did a yoga afternoon with Nadia Narain, and she was working with someone that you know, Nicola Dunn, who also Family Constellations. But I don't know if she was billed as doing family constellations or just being part of the day. But we did some writing, and what immediately came up in the writing for me was a direct connection with my paternal grandfather that I'd lost touch with when I was 8, and I had no conscious recollection of, really. I just had a kind of feeling energetically, and whenever I'd ask questions about him, I was kind of met with he just sort of nothing about his character, you know, no, who he was or what he was or who I was to him or he was to me or anything like that. And yet, bam, he came up in this session for me to begin to make some kind of connection to, and it felt very conscious, actually. And that was, and so there is this capacity within it to build bridges to sort of people who've been lost, isn't there? You know, who are part of the constellation. I know you said that earlier, but I
No, it's
just
key.
wanted to share that. Yeah.
Really, it's really key, and it's not something that we sort of have in other things. That it's like an, you know, if you think of an equilibrium, and this person has left the system or gone out of the system, it creates this, you know, imbalance. And so this person's going to try and rebalance it by doing the same thing, or, you know, they'll suffer, they won't thrive. It could be in their relationships, could be in money, could be in health, all of those things. And that's, you know, that's where we want to go and find out who was the missing person. So it can be detective work. We may not know, we may not find them, but we might just bring them in because someone's looking, you know, intently in this space. And it's like, okay, well, let's put someone there in front of them and see what happens, you know. And if there's no energy in it, that's fine, they can sit down again. But we just try it, you know, experiment and see.
Yes. Yeah. Somebody has just asked a question here. Let me just scroll up a little. Is it common for the body to hold transgenerational trauma? Something I've been exploring, says Nikki, for a while. And how is and that being tied into family history. So is it common for the body to hold transgenerational trauma, and can family constellations clear it?
Yeah. So yeah, it is. I mean, there's a lot of research into the transgenerational transmission of trauma that's been going on for the last few years. Like, there's a woman called Rachel Yehuda who did a scientific study. It was her one, I think. There's one study, it might be her, that was second generation Holocaust survivors, so people like me, the children of the Holocaust. And also, I'm not sure if it was her or someone else, I can't remember, I did read all of this stuff, but who did a study into babies who were in utero at the time of 9/11, with mothers who were working in the Twin Towers. So babies who'd been born after that. And okay, there Karen's saying Rachel did the 9/11.
Who did the 9/11 study? Yeah.
And yeah, and it tested their cortisol levels and all of this sort of thing. And so it showed, you know, it showed pretty conclusively that yes, there is a transgenerational transmission of trauma. And
100%. Yeah.
Ways. Yeah. And you know, there's more and more studies, more and more epigenetic research going on. And in terms of, can constellations clear it? That's definitely what a constellation is looking at. It's looking at the transgenerational transmission of trauma. Yeah. Can it clear it? It kind of depends if the system is ready.
Yeah.
So it can certainly start that process. And it may be that more work, you know, if your father is a Holocaust survivor, you might need to do more work, because there's a whole history behind that as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a sort of, it is what we're looking at, yes, in constellations, definitely.
Yeah, and I think we never really know. We were doing the natural menopause course, and we got sort of like halfway through it, and people on the course have been taking homeopathic remedies, and they'd all, in this 1 week, halfway through the course, they all had encountered stressful situations and dealt with them in a completely different way to how they would normally, you know. And so they were like, wow, I'm doing something now which means that I can respond in a more measured way to a stressful situation. And just to come back to 9/11, I'll never forget a child who was a child of, you know, being carried through 9/11. And it took me a little while, because she was in my consultancy room, appearing very confident, very able, asking a lot of questions. And yet she wasn't really responding to remedies. And we went right back to what was going on in utero, and the fact that in utero she'd experienced this huge trauma. And actually her confidence was masking the fact that she absolutely needed to know what was going on in the room, because of an underlying very adrenally charged state, you know. And sometimes it can be quite difficult to recognize trauma depending on how we manifest, you know, the flight, fight, you know, response, and how quickly we become aggressive, for instance, you know, might indicate that actually there's something underneath which is very deep. And so,
and I mean,
you know,
a lot of
always
people,
uncovering that.
Yeah, a lot of people are in survivor mode because we have to, you know.
Yeah,
so.
But how is it survival? I think it's very easy for us to say I'm in survival mode, or, you know, it's stress central here, but it's like, how does that manifest, and how do we
Yeah, I mean,
how
the
do we
survivor can
respond?
be really strong and not
Yeah.
have an issue. Like this little girl sounds like, you know, she
Yeah.
was a really strong survivor who
Yeah.
probably was getting her through life. So thank you, survivor, you know.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
there's more to life, you know, and ultimately,
Absolutely. Than striving. I mean,
Yeah.
what was there was striving, you know.
Yeah.
And it was like there wasn't an ability to relax and play and be, because the world was a very unsafe space. And so she strived to make it known. She had to know what was going on all the time. And that was
Yeah, there was
hard work for the parents,
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a Constellations facilitator, Franz Ruppert, who wrote several books, but one of them was called Splits in the Soul, about how when there's trauma, you split into three, which one part is the traumatized child, one part is the survivor, and the other part is the healthy adult. So it's, the work is attempting to bring them all together and have the healthy adult in charge when it's appropriate, and the survivor can come up as needed, and so on. But most of the time we want to be in our healthy adult, because that's how, aphorism 9, Hahnemann, like, so we can live for the higher purposes of our existence.
Yeah, exactly. Feel good place. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned someone just then, I think you said Frank, someone, but how did it come about? What did Family Constellations come out of? Who why, who, well, we say why, but how, who?
Yeah, so the founder of Family Constellations was Bert Hellinger, and he was born in 1925 in Germany, and he was born into a very, very devout Roman Catholic family. So much so that he didn't get signed up to the Hitler Youth, because he was in like a seminary for sort of trainee priests as a young man, as a boy actually, when war broke out. And so he avoided that, but he did get conscripted at 18, and he ended up seeing active service in the war. And he spent the last period of time in a prisoner of war camp in Belgium. And when he came out of that, he did become a Roman Catholic priest. And eventually he became a missionary in South Africa, living with the Zulu people. And he lived there for, we think, about 16 years. And during that time, he was really immersed in the culture, and he learned a lot about Zulu culture. And eventually he got sick of the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church. And he came back to Germany, went back to Germany and decided to leave the church. And he got into different kinds of group work, like primal scream, and different kinds of therapy, primal scream, transactional analysis, Gestalt, and so on. And gradually he started practicing in groups things that brought in all these modalities and everything he learned from the Zulu people, which we assume is like the stuff about the ancestors. And there's a lot of kind of shamanic stuff in that weaves into constellations. And it's kind of assumed that it comes from this experience that Hellinger had with living with the Zulu people. And there's other people who know more about that, like South African constellations facilitators like Tanya Mayberg. She does an annual conference in South Africa, and there's pilgrimages to where Hellinger was in the mission and so on. And where was I? Oh yeah, so then he started doing these groups, and some of his colleagues were like, this work you've got, he was ready to retire, but they were like, no, you can't retire. This work is really powerful, and more people want to try it. And so he carried on, and he created Family Constellations. This was sort of late 80s, early 90s, and loads of people started coming to his groups. And he was presenting to like audiences of 200 people in this country and around the world and stuff. Well, all around the world, and in some places, it's become extremely well used and popular. Like in Brazil, it's used in the family courts because they had like this backlog of divorce cases that they couldn't get through. So they decided to bring in Family Constellations, and we sort of through all of it. And in different places in the world, it's really, really popular.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was really from Hellinger and his colleague Hunter Beaumont and Gunther Weber who got him to sort of get out in the world and do more of it. And then there's a sort of there's the generation below them who there was no formal training. Like Hellinger said, you all you need to do is accept your parents and you can facilitate. but they were training in other ways, and they were following Hellinger around and going to his workshops, and he was always teaching. There's videos. In fact, there's some fantastic videos on YouTube that you can look up with a guy, or they're in Mexico. It's Bert Hellinger in Mexico, and yeah, so this second generation then of facilitators, some of them then started to have formal trainings, including Barbara, who trained me, and Dan Cohen, who I also train with in the States, and Stefan Hausner, who I train with as part of Barbara's training. Yeah, and various other people who are my teachers as well. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, look, we can share some of those, names, maybe a couple of links in the in follow-up email, but and I'll put that in show notes actually on YouTube. Someone said, Julie says, I did this for my dissertation to show how trauma is carried down the male line as well as the female line. Fascinating stuff. And when you were talking about the Zulu setting and his experience, somewhere along the line, that had just been before then, I wanted to ask about the broader space that perhaps this could be used in. So if we can use this for healing family, individuals, future generations, what is the scope for using this for a much bigger group of people? I mean, one of the things that, there's a couple of things on my mind today, and one is that there was a statistic or an article I read this morning that said that 1 in 5 teens deaths are currently due to suicide. Well, obviously teenagers don't die that often, but for 1 in 5 to be suicide, I was like, wow, what are we collectively not doing right here? And then the bigger picture about, kind of nationwide trauma, like what's going on in our society at the moment. Are there opportunities to look wider?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunities to look wider. And there are lots of people who do collective constellations, including Dan Cohen, who I train with. He does a lot of collective constellations. What you need is the person who's bringing the issue. We need to sort of hone down why, what's their driving force to need to heal the world. Because that's probably more to do with them being bigger than their parents than the actual need to heal the world. But if we want to look at something, just purely see what's happening there, what's behind it, then we still ideally, I always find with constellations, if there isn't a really clear longing from the client or someone, then it becomes very chaotic.
Interesting.
So I always try to tone it down and say, what is your longing? Because it makes it easier to work with. And, if the longing is, like we do environmental constellations, if the longing is related to, something that's part of a collective, that's fine. We set it up and we look at it and we set it up and see what's going on. Where it's going to be healing is probably with the client, feeling better in themselves and with their family system, because they're never just sitting there on their own. They're always there with their family system. And it's used in organizations as well. So, some massive corporations use constellations, systemic constellations, like Mercedes-Benz and one of the big pharmaceutical companies, and, lots of, yeah, I know. And that's, I suppose because of many of the things that I've said, like we're moving out beyond right and wrong and sort of looking at what is just genuinely as it is. And so, there's always that aspect of, can we do that in this situation with this client? What's their bias? Where's it coming from? And so on.
Yeah. Absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed exploring this a bit more. I just wonder, any questions? Anyone want to put a hand up and ask a question? Or we don't have any other questions in the chat box, not that I can see.
Oh, there's one out of interest. What homeopathic remedies come to mind when a client wants to
heal their world? Oh dear. I mean, again, that comes back to the querent, doesn't it? It's like whether someone is altruistic, whether they are people pleasing. I mean, what would you throw into there? I want to heal
Yeah,
the
I
world.
would.
Do you want to be known for healing the world, or do you
Yeah,
just want to do it quietly?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. If you want to be known, maybe you're like a podium or something, and
Exactly,
if
exactly.
you're doing it because you've got to save the world, you're more in the
Yeah,
cosmos and stakes and so on. So yeah,
yeah. I once had a client who he had he had some kind of intestinal cancer, I think maybe a liver cancer. And I said, so what's your response to this? And he said, I just want to cut it out with a knife. And I was like, okay. So we have in front of us somebody who is prepared to use a knife. Not many remedies would do that. So it really helps
yeah.
hone down when you've got a little bit more information about why you'd want to save the world.
So we
um
just asked, can a mother move stuff for children during
yes,
constellation work?
yeah.
And
And
yeah,
you were saying that with your children. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. We're all part of the family system. So if it's adult children, I'd usually suggest that they do the work. But if they're really not able or willing to, then if it's really affecting the parent, then of course it can be looked at. Yeah.
Fantastic. Look, thank you so much. I'm going to share some information. Do you want to say anything about what you've got coming up? What's in the next few months for you in terms of what offerings you have?
Yeah. So actually on Thursday, I'm going to South, which is a little gathering in South Wales where there's lots of stuff going on. And one of those things is Family Constellations with me on the Sunday. And also I'll be joining Ian Banyard, he's doing nature walks. So I'm going to be doing some nature constellations
Mhm,
with him,
mhm.
hopefully.
At,
And
at
then
Camp Out.
at Camp Out,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm,
Yeah. And then
hmm.
after that, I go straight to Unicorn Family Constellations Camp, which is in Somerset near Bradford on Avon. And there are still a few spaces left for that. That's facilitated mainly by Barbara Morgan.
Hmm.
And that's that first camp I went to in 2015 that was life changing. And I'll be facilitating an opening and a closing ceremony there. Um, and then I have a work, actually, Dan Cohen's coming over from Ireland, and I'm doing some movement, embodied work at that in Ireland from the 24th of August to the 28th. And then I'm going back to Ireland in September to facilitate a workshop on the weekend of the equinox, 21st, 22nd, with my friend Ricky. She's hosting me to do that. And then I've got a retreat in October. There are still a few spaces left. That's in South Wales as well. And it's 3 days, the 3rd to the 6th of October. That's also constellations in nature.
Mm.
And then yeah, I haven't yet decided what's happening after that. But if you sign up to my very sporadic newsletter on my website, then you will get that information, and it's just poppyaltmann.com.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you. I'll put that in the follow-up email, but I'll also put it in the show notes underneath this on YouTube. So please, if you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe, because that really helps us all get the message out there. And it is a really good message. Thank you so much, Poppy. I really, really appreciate that. And thank you to everybody who joined. I will pause the recording just there.